All right, let's do this. Agnosticism and the definition of atheism. At least I'm going to say my piece and leave it at that. No more strawmen. People with a seeming disdain for Steve McRae, arguably the community's agnostic target dummy, seem to have taken it upon themselves to find him a burden. In so doing, they become so blinded by their interests in ponage as to lose sight as to what it is that matters. I'm going to attempt to get us out of the weeds while also discussing a topic near and dear to me, speech acts. So this is a little long, but you're getting a twofer, so deal with it. When we speak, we are performing acts that make reference to states of affairs and express our commitment to them. In our communicating, we partake in an activity with other humans, expressing meanings with a given use and context, and we respond to the act by way of showing that we've understood or not understood. This can entail everything from a head nod to a line of action response that confirms to the person conveying that it was understood. To use language is to take part in an exchange, with our meaning being the currency of intelligibility. That is to say, communication is predicated on the assumption that we are accurately representing what it is we think is the case. In other words, that we are asserting what it is we believe is true. The form by which we assert is the constative proposition. These are expressions affirming what it is we believe constitutes the state. When we assert statements like, my wife is upstairs, or the number of gumballs is even, we take utterances to mean, I believe it is the case that my wife is upstairs, or I believe it is the case that the number of gumballs is even. So what about if someone asserts, I do not know if my wife is upstairs, or I do not know if the number of gumballs is even? These are no different. The person is asserting the constitution of a state of affairs. State of affairs being speculated about is the person's own state of belief. It would be to say, I believe I do not know my wife is upstairs, or I believe I do not know if the number of gumballs is even. There is no difference as to these propositions about the world. So whether I say my wife is upstairs or I do not know my wife is upstairs, in both cases I'm asserting a proposition. Propositions are truth apt, which is to say they have the ability to correspond to what is in fact the case. My wife is upstairs can be expressed in terms of reasons to think it the case, and such that when inference rules are applied in a logically valid form to sound premises, the result leads us to a true conclusion. It is by the rendering of the justification that we establish what our confidence ought to be in our beliefs so as to act appropriately, and is the means by which we persuade others, both of the belief and its being rationally believed. With respect to speech acts, meeting our burden bolsters the confidence of others in our commitments, and it's cashed out in the trust with which others will reciprocate and act in relation to us. It builds our credit as a reliable actor. Rendering justification is the means by which the wheels for successful interactions are greased. Now, there's been a lot of talk about psychological states, and if anything, this has clouded the issue because it has been taken by some as an alternative mechanism that avoids burdens. This confusion over what they represent has resulted in people thinking there's some double standard at work. With the notion that propositions are assertions concerning states of affairs, what is the assertion being made when someone expresses that they are not in a position to assert with respect to the state of affairs? The assertion, as I said before, is with respect to their ability to assert. So if we want to refer to their position with relation to the state of affairs, God exists, it can't be in terms of that proposition. And so if we insist on making reference to that belief concerning the proposition, we make comment about their psychological state. They lack the belief. But this is no different than making a comment as to the psychological state of the atheist or the theist. They both hold a belief with respect to the proposition. Psychological states are offered as a means by which to talk about the condition an individual is in with respect to the presence or absence of a belief. But we don't analyze psychological states for truth. We analyze propositions, and thus, in the case of the agnostic, we can analyze the psychological state expressed as a proposition. I lack both the belief that gods exist and that gods do not exist. If Steve utters that proposition, he has a burden. His burden would be to render the reasons by which he believes that he lacks a belief. He could be in denial. He could have adequate reasons to think it and be irrational in thinking that he does not. Further, as an atheist, I may have reasons for him to think one way or another about it, and were I to challenge him with those reasons, he'd be on the hook for his burden in demonstrating those to be shit reasons to think it. And let's be clear, Steve McRae has had no problem accepting that this is in fact his burden. And just as a comment on the brief but unsuccessful attempt to pin on Steve the label of a Huxleyan agnostic and the position of saying that gods are unknowable, Just an FYI, that is no more about the proposition God exists than Steve's position, I do not know if God exists. That is an assertion as to one's access to the justification for thinking one way or the other. It's not some third position with respect to truth if God exists. It is an assertion as to whether such a proposition can be justifiably evaluated. Steve McRae does not assert that gods are unknowable. So your difficulty in determining his assertion from his utterance, he does not know one way or the other, doesn't translate into him taking on a burden he's not claimed. Ultimately, we can do away with pissing over the labels, which are themselves simply meant to be shorthand, and to get on to talking about what it is we think is the case and why it is we think it. We can set aside all talk of philosophical and psychological dispositions which cloud the issue when used for ill-gotten gains, and simply ask this: what is asserted, and what are the reasons it's being asserted? That's quite literally all we care about. But Bert, are you saying the labels and definitions don't matter? No, especially when they are taken advantage of to act in infidelitous ways. And now I'm going to fold back in this notion of speech acts. Our utterances are predicated on a sincerity in our representing our true beliefs concerning states of affairs. When I say to my wife, I'll be home later and then we can get a bite to eat, or, hey, the bus is outside, I better get going, I'm committing myself to positions with respect to the state of affairs for the purpose of causing her to act in accordance with what I intend. I'm setting up expectations and I'm committing to their fulfillment. There's a normativity intrinsic to communication, as its very ability to function is predicated on truth for intelligibility. Were we all not accurately representing our positions with respect to states, speech would not be understood. A person who could lie all the time would be a person for whom communication would be impossible. With a breakdown of trust, there is no act of speech which could be intelligible, and thus no act that could cause a warranted reciprocation. And as a note, this is ingredient as to why we hate liars and why we'd hate those who take advantage of us by way of deception. In my eyes, speech acts are the ground for moral realism, but that's another video for another time. And this is where my two reasons for militating against this merely lacking a belief derive. Our communication is predicated on sincerity and an interest in fidelitous, truth-rich interactions. Our acts aren't simply predicated on an adherence to the letter of the law or a contract. It's much deeper than that. Conversation entails an understanding of demeanors and an understanding of contexts. It's pliable and it's dynamic. We have assumptions regarding each other's adherence to norms, from mannerisms to gestures to tones. When a person asks his wife the question, "Did you remember to get the car washed this morning?" Such a question isn't just a literal take on the words expressed. It involves a full state, such that, were she to know it is in reference to an earlier conversation about getting the car washed in order to support the local school in a fundraiser, that context is implied in the asking. Were she to have gone to the wrong car wash and felt some shame in the truth, her answering the question, "Yes, I remembered," without further explanation would be a violation of this trust. It would constitute a falsehood, not in the technical sense, but would constitute a violation of the rules in the language game being played between a husband and a wife. Or to use my bridge analogy, were a structural engineer aware of his own uncertainty as to a bridge's safety based on some fact about the bridge, and were he approached by an individual and asked, "Do you believe the bridge is unsafe?" his truly agnostic, "No, I lack such a belief," being technically an answer to the question, would be cold comfort to the person who fell to their death when attempting to cross the bridge. Our expectation is not of a to-the-letter adherence. It's more than that. It is to take each other's meaning from the full context and with the knowledge of each other's interests. Speech does not just concern the words coming from our mouths. An answer of, "Well, he should have asked me if the bridge was unsafe," doesn't cut it. Our norms in communicating go much deeper than that. And if you don't believe me, take time to think about all the shorthand you're implying when the expectation of being understood is met. So, with these normative grounds for sincere interactions in mind, let us now get to the issue at hand concerning the definition of atheism. There's no 5 years in the wilderness, as according to Nate Broady. No one is railing against the person who responds to the question, do you believe God exists, with the answer, no, I lack such a belief. No one has suggested that a person answering as such is a liar. None of us have said that such an answer is wrong. That's just a straw man. We're not idiots. There are more than 2 doxastic states with respect to the proposition God exists. You can affirm the proposition as true or reject it as false. You can assert that you are undecided as to the truth or falsity of the proposition. You can assert the proposition is senseless. You can reject the proposition on the grounds that to opine one way or the other is unwarranted due to a lack of adequate justificatory procedures by which to render a decision. You can be indifferent as to the truth or falsity of the proposition. This hasn't been a confusion over what is being asserted. This is an issue with insincerity with respect to what is being done with the definition. And there are 2 fronts upon which this has been charged: American atheists and lack-theist trolls. Think about this. Our beliefs form the map by which we traverse the territory. The person whose map has a town as a feature will journey there confidently based on that map, whereas a person whose map is undecided as to that location will not. We act or do not act based on our maps, and we are less committed to act in those cases where our map is uncertain, aka where we lack a belief one way or the other. And as we've said, both those who are willing to assert no gods exist and those who feel they can neither assert no gods exist nor gods exist can be said to lack a belief in gods. But taking the map analogy, think about what that entails. That's merely to say neither person has a belief that there is a mountain occupying a space in the map. That one of those has firmly penciled in a town in that vacant spot is an incredibly important distinction between those 2 lacking the belief in the mountain. Their interests and concerns and their actions, in relation to that firmly drawn feature will be substantially different than those yet to conclude the matter. So with that in mind, now take the highly politically engaged organization American Atheist, and it's actively working to change the definition listed on various dictionary sources, from the belief that no gods exist to the lack of a belief in gods. As an aside, if you don't believe me that this is happening, you can check out a screen share of a Google search in my Hangout with David Silverman from a few years ago and compare it to now, or you can read his book and hear it from his own mouth. This yokes together the person who has a firm belief concerning the state with the person who is undecided. And this would be no issue if American atheists were acting according to the proposition, I lack a belief. But their actions have betrayed such a notion. They are militating, quite obviously, for the proposition, no gods exist. They have pushed for this definition because, by subsuming this group who also lack a belief, they are doubling their numbers for atheists with respect to census or demographic data, which means a more powerful lobby. But it is at the cost of those whose map looks very different from their own, and whose inability to commit one way or the other leads them to a very different agenda. As former American Atheist President David Silverman, whom I challenged on this topic, said to me point blank in a hangout, "Tough shit, I don't care about them." The definition they are militating for isn't in accord with their own actions, and, as I will touch on in the end, isn't in accord with the use determined by the public at large. They have been unprincipled in their endeavor, and instead of bolstering their numbers through persuasion and good arguments for people to think gods do not exist, they have taken the cheap and insincere route of subsuming the unwitting. On the second front, we have the internet atheist trolls, who profess merely lacking the belief when pressed for their opinion. When they participate in hangouts or in online discourse, they will use such a definition in lieu of asserting a position. But like American atheists, their actions and utterances will render their own being out of accord with that definition as they rail against the existence of gods. When pressed for the burden in justifying their utterances, they will retreat, pretending they have asserted nothing in the affirmative with respect to the proposition. This is intellectual cowardice, and a violation of the norms with respect to being a responsible epistemic agent and a sincere interlocutor interested in being intelligible. It is for these reasons that I come out against such a definition. I have yet to find someone looking to merely use it to state their own state of belief, or to yoke themselves in purpose and intention with those who can't make up their minds. It is instead being used as a device by which to subsume others for the purposes of political action or to play hide the ball with respect to justifying their own commitment and shirking the burden for the words coming out of their own mouths. I'll now offer a pragmatic appeal before offering an argument as to what appears to be the true meaning. Having the definition entail one's state of belief concerning belief in the proposition rather than the belief itself is useless. No one is primarily interested in your state of belief concerning your beliefs. They are interested in whether you're of the opinion that gods exist or not. To start with, I lack a belief leaves us with yet one more question to ask, for there is no action we can derive from merely knowing you lack a belief in one direction. It's not sufficient for proceeding in discourse on the topic. But beyond this pragmatic appeal, it seems to me that the public at large is very clear on what the term atheist means. Certainly, Nate betrayed this lack-theist definition in his very own hangout this week on the Three Black Heathens with Christopher Maute. When Nate asked Chris around the 8-minute mark, "Where do you stand on the God topic?" Chris responded, "On a bad day, I'm an atheist." And from that point on, the use for the entire hangout of the term atheist was synonymous with the assertion, "No gods exist." At no point did Nate stop Chris for clarification, somehow confused as to what Chris meant by the term. All expressions from both host and guests were in accord with the definition, a person who asserts no God exists. And for those who would like to make some appeal to etymology, you must be melancholy and a little less gay to discover that, first, etymology does not determine meaning, and second, the derivation is from the 5th century BC from atheos, which means without gods, not without beliefs. In closing, what matters is that our interactions with each other have a normative component which is violated on pains of being intelligible. We ought to be sincere in our transactions, seeking what it is each other thinks, and leaving behind this use of sep as a cudgel with which to gain the upper hand on an opponent. What matters is what we are asserting and what are our reasons for asserting it, and where we can remove the clutter and lay those out clearly so as to engage in honest and sincere truth-finding expeditions, rather than avoiding burdens or looking to find individuals unwarranted ones, the more we can leverage each other's maps so as to better understand the world. Cheers, and thanks for watching.